lost his way before today, but anyway, well, we will ask him. Good morning. Today is day 1 of 2 for this public workshop to receive information regarding analytical tools for evaluating water supply, hydrodynamic, and hydropower effects. Day 2 will be held tomorrow in this room. This workshop is part of Phase 2 of the State Water Board's review of the 2006 Water Quality Control Plan for the Bay Delta Estuary. Phase 1, which is still ongoing, addresses San Joaquin River flows and Southern Delta water quality issues. Phase 2 addresses potential modifications to the remainder of the Bay Delta plan and focuses on fish and wildlife beneficial uses. I'm Fran Spivey-Weber of the State Water Resources Control Board, and with me today are board members Steve Moore to my right and Felicia Marcus to my left, and Tam Doduk will be back in just a few minutes, and I expect Charlie any moment. Also present is Richard Sadkowski, Senior Engineer, and Karen Ninya, Senior Engineer, and Diane Riddle, yes, back there, okay, Environmental Program Officer, Manager, rather, and Dr. Brock Bernstein, a subcontractor for ICF International, who is the workshop facilitator. Before we get started, there is an evacuation procedure. Please look around and identify the 2 exits closest to you, and in the event of a fire alarm, you're required to evacuate this room immediately. Take your valuables with you and do not use the elevators. Exit down the stairway and go to our relocation site, which is catty corner across the street at Cesar Chavez Park. Also, we have an overflow room. It doesn't look like we're going to need it today in the Sierra hearing room, which is just out the back door and to the right. This workshop is being held according to the public notice dated June 22nd, 2012, and revised on August 15, 2012. This is an informal workshop. The State Water Board will not take any formal action today, and there will be no sworn testimony or cross-examination of participants. However, the State Water Board and its staff do plan to ask questions of the panelists. There's no court reporter present today. We are broadcasting this workshop on the internet and preparing an audio and video recording. So be sure when you speak into the microphone and identify yourself. First, we will hear a short introduction from staff and Dr. Bernstein. Then we will hear from the various panels. After the panels have presented their information today and tomorrow, we will hear comments from the public. If you intend to speak tomorrow, please fill out a blue speaker card today or tomorrow and give it to our staff. If you are not sure whether you wish to speak, fill out a card and mark if necessary. In order to ensure that all participants have an opportunity to participate, comments may be limited to 5 minutes per speaker. To avoid repetition and in the interest of time, if there are groups of you with the same comments, please pick a spokesperson to present your comments. And if you've got beepers or phones turned on, take them out and turn them off or on vibrate. And now I'll turn this over to Richard to do the introduction, and then to Dr. Bernstein.
Good morning, Vice Chair Spivey-Weber, members of the board. With me, I'm Richard Sadkowski, a senior engineer with the Division of Water Rights. With me is Karen Nia, also a senior engineer. I went over the background for these workshops and the Bay Delta planning activities during the last 2 workshops, and won't repeat it here today unless you prefer it. I will, however, summarize the workshop topics and the questions, and then turn it over to Brock. Kevin, will you? There you go. As part of its update of the 2006 Bay Delta Plan, the State Water Board will consider fish and wildlife, as well as other public interest needs for the water, including municipal, industrial, agricultural, power, and recreational uses. As part of this work, the water supply, hydrodynamic, and hydropower effects of implementing the Bay Delta plan and the update to the plan will need to be determined. The questions outlined in the workshop include what types of analysis should be completed to estimate the water supply, hydrodynamic, and hydropower effects of the potential changes to the plan, and what analytical tools should be used to evaluate these effects. What are the advantages, disadvantages, and limitations of these tools? We received written summaries from the 24 parties shown on this and the next slide, and more than 35 additional documents from the commenters. All materials have been shared with the workshop participants and have been posted on the State Water Board's website, and we are in the process of posting the 35 additional comments, comment materials. Go ahead and just show the other part of the 24. Anyways, with that short introduction, this concludes my presentation. Karen and I are available to answer any questions, and if there are no questions, I'll turn it over to Brock for an overview for the day.
Thank you. So I think all of you have seen the agenda, and please see me if you have trouble with your presentations, or Kevin over there if you have trouble loading your presentations, or you have any problems with your schedule. We have a lot of people up here. I would like to remind you, please turn your microphone off if you're not speaking, and also there is a little bit of feedback, so people listening in remotely can still hear you even if your microphone is off. So be careful about making side comments during other people's presentations. Okay, so again, thanks for coming. We have a full couple of days, so Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Brock, and good morning, Vice Chair Spivey Weber and members of the board. At your request and your staff's request, the Delta Science Program were invited to put together a panel, if you recall, to kick off each of the 3 workshops. And for this particular panel, our staff liaison is Chris Enright, who's just sitting in the back row, and I'd like to thank Chris for pulling the panel together and for all of the logistics associated with that. So the panel you're going to hear from today have the emphasis, as you heard, on water resources, hydrodynamic modeling, hydraulic modeling, and hydropower modeling. We do have one outlier to that. We were looking for consistency, so our staff liaison, part of that was to ensure communication across these various invited panels. And in order to do that, we have one ecological modeler, Dr. John Durand, who has been looking to see how some of these models might fit into the whole suite of models to answer some of the questions that you're facing. I'd really like to thank the panelists for the amount of time and effort they've put into this. They've had all-day meetings. There's been a lot of internet traffic from many continents at certain times of the year when this got started. So there's been a lot of effort that they've put in for the presentation you're about to hear. You'll see the panelists' names in a moment, but I just wanted to say, give you some idea of the composition here so that if you have direct questions, you'll know which of the members have various expertise. We're particularly pleased that Marianne Goen was able to join the panel. She's representing the California Water and Environmental Modeling Forum, QEMF. And this is really quite a unique group that was set up almost 2 decades ago to try and coordinate some of the modeling going on in Bay Delta issues. So thank you, Marianne, for participating. We then have 3 hydrodynamic hydraulic modelers, Dr. John DeGeorge, Mark Stacey, and Pete Smith. We also had from the USGS John Bureau, who is not only a hydrodynamic modeler, but he really looks at data collection. And he is probably the sole person who's put together this very comprehensive monitoring program for the Delta. So he understands the value of data, the statistical design of data networks, and how that fits into modeling. William Smith had kindly agreed to step up to provide the hydropower economy links and has been a very valuable addition to the panel. And the last two members are Greg Gartrell and Jay Lund. It's difficult to put them in any box. Their experience is right across the whole spectrum of modeling, from water resource optimization, hydrodynamic modeling, and how that links up into cascades of models. So we really appreciate, on behalf of the Delta Science Program, these individuals who've really put a lot of effort. And now I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Jay Lund, who is going to start off the presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for having us. It's been a great pleasure to work with these distinguished panel members on this really interesting problem that we're going to be enduring with for decades to come of how do we analyze this very difficult and interesting system. The theme of today, and I'm not sure if you can read, I guess you have screens to read the PowerPoint. The theme of this morning presentation is that modeling is about developing insights. It's actually not about numbers, which is what most people like to give you. So let's go to the next slide, please. We've just gone through the panel members, and we've put a few representative equations up there that there'll be a quiz at the end about. Just an overview of the presentation. We're going to have sort of a hybrid presentation today. Again, we'll talk about a little bit about that modeling is really about insights, not numbers. And this is sort of a famous old quote from the 1960s in the early days of computer science. And then we'll have some wonderful animations that John DeGeorge and the folks at RMA have put together on basically the basic physics of the delta. So we wanted to sort of mix with the formal presentation of our formal report to you all, which you've all had a chance to read, and fortunately fairly short. Some basic ideas on how the delta works, just to help improve your intuition and sort of see how the modeling can be used to help people develop better intuitions for how the system works. The first part of that will be on basic physics, the basic processes of the delta. And then we'll have me come back and present some of our written report, which is basically centered around getting better established insights for the board from modeling results. In the report, written report, you'll see some comments on different models, but rather than have a long and rather boring litany of models and what we think are strengths and weaknesses, we thought we'd better put this in a bigger context, because that's really what you ought to be doing, we think. Then after my boring talk, we'll get some more exciting animations from John DeGeorge on looking at sort of management implications, management examples of some model results. And then I have, I think, one slide at the very end where we talk about insights and estimates and controversy and how models might or maybe might not be helpful in some of these questions, and then time for questions. So let's go to the next. See, that was all I had to say about insights and modeling, just that's what it's about. And so we'll move right from this into John DeGeorge's first raft of animation.
Thank you, Jay. I just did, can you hear me? Okay. How about that? All right, thank you. So we'd like to use part of our presentation time to show some animations that I hope will be interesting and I hope will help you see things a little bit more clearly. And these are actually just a small set of a large possible suite of animations that might be helpful to the board staff, legislative staff, researchers, anybody who has to work in the Delta and who may or may not have actually thought a lot about how it really works. So a couple things I want to point out in this first section. One is that the Delta is a set of rivers flowing into an estuary. Where these rivers join the tidal regime is a very important part of how the system works and how fish and contaminants and constituents move through the system. And that mixing and movement is really what Delta modeling is about. There's three primary mechanisms that you want to look for when you think about the Delta. There's the net flows driven from river inflows and from the exports and demands in the system. There's tidal mixing. The tidal excursion in the system is very, very important in moving things around. And then there's gravitational circulation. And I think your first workshop on X2, you probably heard a lot about gravitational circulation, and I'll just touch on that very briefly. But again, this suite of animations that I'm going to show is kind of a humble first toss out. I think there's a lot that could be gained from this, and hopefully you find them interesting. But first, why would you believe what a model shows you? And I'm going to address this question from the perspective of a delta modeler, but this very same thing is something that you would think about in terms of any of the realms of modeling that you would look at. Hydropower modeling, water supply modeling, ecological modeling. First, you want to look and say, well, does this model match any of your observations? And in the delta, there's a lot of really useful point time series that a modeler can take and hold up against their model and see how it works. Stage, flow, salinity, other water quality parameters are now being collected, turbidity, sediments, sediment concentrations. And if John Bureau was here, I would thank him in person, but of course he's not here. So you'll just have to take that from me later. But now that you put these two things together, what are you actually looking for? It's nice that these wiggly lines may line up, sort of, but what are you actually looking for? And I think this is the key thing. Whenever you look at any model, you want to put computed and observed next to each other, and you want to look for characteristics of that system. In terms of the delta, you want to look for whether the delta model is representing key net flow splits. Is the Sacramento splitting into the delta cross channel appropriately? Is the San Joaquin splitting into Old River at head appropriately? You want to look for any controls on the system. Are the gates operating? Can you see the influence of the Clifton Court barriers? Can you see the influence of the South Delta temporary barriers? Are the primary drivers being represented like net island consumptive use, the Delta Island consumptive use? It's a crude estimate, but how do you have it in there? How is it working in the Delta? How does this model transfer from low flow to high flow periods? Is it doing that appropriately? Does it represent a long time scale process like the yearly cycle of salt intrusion? And what about kind of tidally averaged information like spring neap variations? So just putting some plots of computed and observed isn't enough. But of course, that's where we start. So forgive me if this is a little busy. But this is a common thing you'll see in the Delta, if I can get my pointer here. I picked 3 representative stations, one up on the Sacramento, one at Jersey Point, and one at Old River. And the 3 primary parameters, stage, flow, and EC. And something that you'll typically see is a tidal timescale comparison where you plot 15-minute or hourly data from a model and from the observed data on top of each other. And it gets pretty busy. It's wiggling up and down with the tides every day. But it's still an important thing. Another important thing is to look at the tidally averaged timescale, where you take and average out the tide and look at the behavior over a longer period. And that smooths this. So here in the EC record, because the tide is moving back and forth, this EC is going up and down because there's a salt gradient moving back and forth. But if you even that out, you see this slope, which means something. Another thing that you want to look for is some kind of statistical comparison, because just lining up the lines isn't really enough. You want to try to look at some comparison of computed and observed, and there's a variety of ways of doing this. And each modeler will present it a little bit differently, but that's another important part of this comparison. Okay, so now you've got these wiggly lines, but really, what can you see? What are you really looking for? Well, I've looked at these for quite a while, and I think some others in the audience here have looked at these for quite a while, but probably not everyone. And when I look at this stage plot, I'm looking at how the phase and amplitude of this signal matches. Is this wave moving into the delta at the correct speed? As it moves through the delta, is it attenuating correctly? Is it dampening out correctly? And so the details of how, oops, I lost my mouse. The details of how these two things match is important to me. Another thing we look for is the spring neap variation. As the cycle of the moon goes, the tides go from a very strong, large amplitude to a lower amplitude. That actually generates a filling and draining of the delta over the 14-day cycle. And you can see that here in the tidally average of this going up and down in a 14-day cycle. So we would look for that. Another thing, here's a flow record near in Old River, just south of Bacon Island. And if you look at this flow record, it's not a simple tidal signal like you'd see in other parts of the delta. You get these really weird short time wiggles that occur, like here. And what that is actually the regional effect of the Clifton Court gate operations. If you get the gate operations opening and closing the way they're supposed to, you see the signal move through the delta, and the computed and observed flows will match up. And what about on the longer time? You look at the influence of the exports. Here's going from a period of relatively low exports, and I know you can't read that, but that's a negative number of net flow on Old River, to stronger exports and stronger exports. You should see the demand play out through these observations in the delta. And then over here, that slope that I was getting at, this is the rate of salt intrusion that pulls together those three processes that I mentioned: net flows, tidal mixing, and gravitational circulation. If you get that balance wrong, that slope will be different. It'll come in too fast, or it'll come in too slow, and the delta model isn't right. So that's nice. I would imagine that still there's some folks in the audience who haven't looked at these kinds of pictures long enough, and it still looks like just wiggly lines to them. So how do you move from a point of just seeing wiggly lines to actually feeling like you understand the physics of the system? And that's what I hope these animations are useful for. So here's an animation, and I believe Walter Beret showed this in one of the earlier workshops, and I just want to bring it up again briefly. This will be an animation of tidal and net flows in the system at point locations, and these happen to be from one of our model runs, but you could just as easily do this from observed data. And let me bring that forward and hit go. So observation number 1. These light blue arrows are tidal flows. The dark blue arrows are net flows. This is a period of very low net delta outflow. This is a very small arrow, and that is a huge arrow. You have hundreds of thousands of cubic feet per second running back and forth in this channel, while the net delta outflow may be just a few thousand. The net flows under really low, let me go back a little bit. At a point of really low net outflow, you can get a negative flow on the San Joaquin River, where it's actually pulling Suisun Bay water up into the delta towards Frank's Tract. And then as the flows increase, that'll turn around and go out. Negative net flows here are bad because it brings salt into the system. Another thing is, way up in the north, these flows are not varying very much. This is riverine flow. In this particular animation, which is it's just an illustration, in this particular one, there's riverine flow down to the cross channel, and then you have small pulsing here below the cross channel on the Sacramento River. Depending on how high the Sacramento River flows are, that riverine flow could move all the way down to Rio Vista. But once you get to Rio Vista, then you're up in the ship channel, and now the tidal flows take over. And then I want to drag this all the way out to where we have over 100,000 CFS net delta outflow. And in this particular simulation, went a little too far. In this particular simulation, even with these high flows, the San Joaquin flow was not exceeding exports until right at the very, very end. And then we just barely got the net flows in the South Delta to turn around. I want to come back to that point about what happens to the San Joaquin water with several different animations, because I think that's a very important thing to see. So now you know that part really well. River and estuary. This is an illustration using particle tracking, where we put particles in the Sacramento River and watch them move down through the riverine section and then break off into the more tidal sections, and then finally into the main channel in the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. So here, dropping particles in every hour, they're moving very rapidly down until they get towards the cross channel, where it peels off some of the flow. So the flow that was originally in the Sacramento is now split across Sutter and Steamboat, Georgiana, and the McCollummy. And now as these particles move down, they get a slow pulsing, and then they really start moving back and forth with the tides once you get into the main channel in the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. Now, again, where exactly that happens depends on the flows, and whether or not they go into the cross channel depends on whether or not it's open. But these are the kinds of behaviors that you'll see in actual observations. So these are animations that John Bureau donated from his acoustically tagged salmon, where he had listening stations tracking these moving down through the system. Some of the salmon were released going down the Sacramento, and they made it I'll run that again. They move down fairly quickly until they get into the main channel, and now they're moving back and forth like the particles in the animated system. Some of these guys actually got I think, and swam back upstream with the straight path that they were inside of, but that's another story. On Georgiana, a similar thing. They move fairly quickly down Georgiana, and once you get into the main channel of the San Joaquin River, you get back into that tidal flow regime. So even though these young salmon can't swim, they're still subject to this tidal motion and mixing system. So let's look a little more particle tracking. The tides, you saw the wiggling line that showed the tide. You saw the arrows moving back and forth. Well, if you integrate that, it actually means these things that you throw in the water or float in the water or are suspended in the water move a really long way. So around the Sacramento River near Edmonton, the tidal excursion is on the order of 6 miles. A little bit lower past the confluence is on the order of 9 miles. John Bureau did a particle drogue test where he threw something out of his boat at an extreme high tide down here near Chips Island, and it went all the way across Sassoon Bay. So the excursion is very far. Another important point is that there's variations in velocity across the channel and down vertically. And turbulent mixing will cause things to spread out a little bit. And because they spread out, they start experiencing different velocities, and then they end up experiencing a very different part of the delta. So if you threw a few hundred particles in a clump, or a few hundred oranges in the water at one place, after a little while, these are going to spread out quite a lot. So in some areas, it's where the channel is very regular, like the Sacramento and this part near Edmonton, they don't spread out too much. But down here near the confluence, they spread out a lot. Another way of looking at that is I'm going to drop particles in a line across these two channels. And these particles are going to live for one tidal day and then stop. And what the picture that you'll start to see is a visualization of tidal mixing. And that the system, because the water is moving up and down in the channels and splitting into different channels and moving back together, is stirring the system. That stirring is part of what causes salt to move upstream from Sassoon Bay into the delta. It's also the thing that would cause an effluent plume to mix around the system, or a cohort of neutrally buoyant larvae or eggs to float around the system and move to very, very different places. So here you get a notion of the tidal mixing in one day from one spot near the confluence on the Sacramento and one spot near Edmonton. Okay, so
John, can I ask you a question,
Certainly.
please? We've seen these particle models for a long time. How do you correlate? And I would agree with your assumption that when you get, certain fish types into an area where you have tidal influence, it impedes their progress either in or out. But how do you quantify or correlate, or I guess correlate would be a better word, fish activity as opposed to particle activity? Because you would have to assume with a particle there's no adaptability. With a species, there's got to be some degree of adaptability. So it's easy for us to sit here and look at these particle models and understand the basic concept. How do you correlate the adaptability of a species to live within and adapt to these changes? I don't understand that.
That's a really good question, and a very
That's my only one for the day. So
a very
thank you.
deep question. I'll give a shot at it fairly quickly, and then we can maybe.
I don't mean to
talk more
interrupt
about
you,
it
but I think
through the day.
it's one thing to look at a hypothetical particle model and
Yeah.
something to understand the adaptability.
So before I start to answer that question, again, what I'm trying to show just in these few animations is actually the physics of mixing, not behavior. But setting that aside, and we'll come back and talk some more about the physics of mixing. When you start to introduce behavior, or when do you need to start to introduce behavior? And I think this is going to be an iterative process that we continue to explore for quite a long time. a number of first steps have been made. Aside from neutrally buoyant particle tracking experiments that have been done, Ed Gross has done particle tracking experiments where it explicitly considers the three-dimensionality. So if a particle is not neutrally buoyant and it has a tendency to float or sink, we've looked at, or Ed has looked at how those particles move differently. So in areas where stratification occurs, that could be a very important thing. And if they're floating, they may tend to move down estuary. If they're sinking, they may tend to move up estuary. And then the trick is, well, what can he compare that against? And he and Wim Kimmerer have been working on that for quite a while. We at RMA worked with Metropolitan Water District in an attempt at adult delta smelt behavior, saying that, well, when delta smelt move upstream during the winter period, there's a notion that that has something to do with the turbidity regime, and that they're waiting for sufficiently high turbidity to move through the delta. And so we experimented and introduced a hypothetical behavior that said, well, if the salinity is too high, the particle wants to move away from the high salinity. It wants to move towards fresher water. If the turbidity is too low, it won't go in that direction. If the turbidity is a little too low but increasing, it'll move towards the higher turbidity until it's happy. And then once it's happy, it'll explore that area with some tidal surfing mechanism. And then we use that as a test against the observed entrainment. And there's some encouraging correlation in some of the results that we've seen. It's not solid. It's not, wow, this is absolutely it. But it was some very encouraging comparisons. Something that's going on right now is John Bureau, a few years ago, did a fairly extensive study with acoustically tagged salmon released into the Sacramento River above the cross channel. And he had an extensive network of listening stations set out where he could watch the movement of these fish around the cross channel in very high resolution 3D detail, and in other areas looking at timing. And John is working with RMA and Ed Gross and Michael McWilliams in doing particle modeling and hydrodynamic modeling for the period where he did his observations. And then John's team is going to be proposing behaviors that these salmon smolt may have had in terms of whether they would prefer to be high in the water column, low in the water column, move at night, move in the day, not have any preference whatsoever. And then we can compare these particle tracks to the observed salmon acoustic tracks. And I think that's going to be the same sort of thing. It's a hypothesis testing. The trick here is in getting sufficient data to do the comparisons. And that was a very, very extensive effort to do that acoustic tagging. And that works for salmon. They're fairly robust fish, but that's much harder to do on something like a smelt. So did that help?
It gets there. I mean, obviously, it's an area that we need more data and more exploration, but I appreciate you taking the time
I
to
think
explain that.
there's definitely a need for an integrated collaboration between the fisheries biologists who are trying to understand how the fish work and making hypotheses, between modelers who can try to put these things into the hydrodynamic and particle tracking model, and between the data collection teams like John's team to go out and actually do the hard work of verifying some of that information.
The problem is we've got plenty of particles and not many of some kinds of fish, so they're the ones we need to
There's that
save.
too, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Let me just add a couple of words to that. Don's given a pretty good explanation. One of the reasons why John Bureau couldn't be here today is because he's out preparing to do a field experiment along these lines.
Yeah.
This experiment is around the first flush of the season because it's expected to rain in the coming days. He has to go out and prepare for that. So that lets you know, I think, how active an area of investigation that this is. The models, I think, have a tremendous potential to help us figure out how much of fish behavior and fish problems is hydrodynamic in origin and how much of it is behavior and ecological in origin and how that interacts. I think that's very important. John Duran, you might want to add something to that.
I have a question to Peter. Within the Delta Science group, is there interaction between the modelers and the fish guides and the hydrodynamic, the monitoring rather, and the modeling and the fish? I mean, is that a place? how do you get this, the mixing of these disciplines?
Actually, that's a very good point, and I would say this is, maybe John can talk to this, this is probably one of the most active research areas right now in the Delta. The technologies have advanced so far in the last just 2 to 3 years that we're just really beginning to explore the full potential of these. So I think that the answer to that is, yeah, these networks are being created. It's an area of intense active researching and coordination. And John, you may want to...
Yeah, so this is an aspect of modeling where the ecologists are far behind. And part of the reason for that is that you can drop a particle and you can actually track a drifter in the system and get that, as John has been speaking to. You can actually look at a correlation. So you can kind of calibrate your model and you can vet it for, is it working? But it's extremely difficult to sort of scale up to the level of a fish, and for a variety of reasons. Fishes that we look at in the system have a number of stages in their life cycle, and so each part of their life cycle may behave differently and may relate to flows or turbidity or food supply in different ways. And so each one of those stages may have different requirements, and these sorts of models give insight. And again, we're coming back to that theme. They give insight that as to some of the relationships to physical parameters that these stages require. And then it goes back to the biologist to work out the physiology, to work out the trophic dynamics. And so where these models function pretty well at this point is tracking nutrients, tracking phytoplankton, chlorophyll A concentration, and even to some degree zooplankton. Although zooplankton, as it turns out, have lots of life cycles and they have complex behaviors too, but getting closer and closer. And of course, if you can get that, then you're working on some of those lower trophic levels that fish are going to respond to behaviorally in their feeding processes. But there's by no means a linear connection that can be modeled that has a predictive capacity for most of our fish populations. Rather, they provide some kind of insight into the biology and the ecology of these fishes, which allow us to go back and do more iterative experimentation and come back and try and relate. And I will say that in general, ecologists have done a poor job of interfacing with the engineers who work on these problems. And vice versa. But we don't, I can speak more from the ecologist because I am one, but we don't do a good job of learning the language of the other side here. And I've been working pretty, I have some good associates that I've been working with, and I've been learning that language, and I think there's a good community that's initially developing, and there's some new research out there. Kimmer and Ed Gross are among them, Bill Fleener is among them, John Bureau, and we have these conversations that are furthering these ideas. So we're on our way. Much more effort is needed to ferret out these connections.
Okay, well, I'm sure we can talk about this more as the days go on. Back to the simple matter of physics and the physics of mixing. Here's an animation of salinity transport in the key kind of central delta area. So if this is the Sacramento River, this is the McCollum River. These are the primary freshwater corridors coming down from the north. This is 3 Mile Slough connecting the Sacramento to the San Joaquin. One of the key connections at this part of the world, moving fresh water from the Sacramento to the San Joaquin. And it's actually kind of neat to watch this. It's on the ebb tide, you have San Joaquin water moving 3 Mile, and then on the flood tide, you get this pulse of fresh water that pushes in to 3 Mile, and then you can see it mixing there. The San Joaquin water had moved up, the salt water moved up past, the fresh water came in, it stirred those things together, you can see the mixing happening. This is one of the corridors that moves fresh water across. There's actually been a project being kicked around for quite a while to put an operable gate in 3 Mile Slough. And what that operable gate would do is control this net flow. And what, in this case, there's salt water a little bit farther up on the San Joaquin. You could push a little more fresh water through 3 Mile Slough by keeping it closed a little bit on the ebb tide and leaving it opened on the full flood tide. And then you could push some of this red color back out again and get more of this blue color over here. This is where the management concept comes from for that. Another really interesting thing is watching the salt water squirt into Frank's Track, like right there. So there's a jet that runs along False River, goes into Frank's Track, and then you have a high energy jet that pushes into Frank's Track, and then that salt water mixes out into the shallows of Frank's Track, and all the salt that just squirted in doesn't go back out again. This is another place where you have dispersive mixing pushing material into Frank's Track. And I'll come back to this again later, but Frank's Track is sort of a key management point in the system, in that it's like a flywheel. Once you've spun it up with salt, it's hard to get rid of that salt. It's hard to push it all back out again. And so the water managers in the Delta have to carefully watch the evolution of salt in Frank's Track through the year so they don't get too much salt into the Old River corridor.
Is that because it's just dealt with through ebb and flow and there's no flow through? Is that the phenomena, or?
Well, in order to get flow through, the Sacramento River won't flow through there. So that's where the primary flows are coming from. It's the San Joaquin River that would flow through there, and you don't have that much water from the San Joaquin. So the only way to get the salt out of there is to actually have a pretty high flow condition or empty all the reservoirs, which
That's probably not an option.
No. So that's why this is a very careful balance. And that's why balancing the salinity in this area is very important, because if you let the salt get too high up past Jersey Point, it jumps into False River and squirts into Frank's Track, and that's the balancing point. And then I won't spend a lot of time on this. This deserves actually a lot of time and presentation. But the gravitational circulation component is the other part of this. If the delta was completely still, there was no tide, there was no river inflow, there was no wind, salt water would just pour in. It's all below sea level. Everything would be completely salty. The reason the delta is not the same salinity as seawater is because fresh water pushes that salt water out. And salt water is heavier than fresh water. If it was moving quietly out, it would flow up over the top of the salt water, and there'd be a stratified lower layer, and you'd have fresh water just pouring out in a thin layer over the top. But it's not quiet. There's in the narrow channel sections of the delta, the flows are moving fairly fast. There's a lot of turbulence. So stratification can't form. In the tidal region of the delta, there's a lot of tidal energy moving the water back and forth. So there's a lot of turbulent mixing, so stratification doesn't form. And so here in this picture, which is a cross-section from the Golden Gate up to, here's the confluence of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin, and then moving up a little past that, even down to here, this energy has kept the salt water from stratifying and moving underneath. And so this is fairly vertical. But then as you get farther out, the fresh water begins to move over the top, and then you have salt water coming up underneath. And let me bring this animation up. This is tidally averaged salinity. So normally you'd see this moving back and forth like a palm tree waving in the wind. This is tidally averaged, so you can see the sort of stable stratification. And this is moving through a low flow period when the salinity is slowly working its way inward over the year. And I'll show you again the same picture from another viewpoint. But the system is managed to allow the salt to slowly move in through the year. And since I don't, and you notice that there's some vertical stratification. These things are tilted slightly. And Greg Cartel reminded me that I should point out this is extremely stretched vertically. If you were to plot this on a 1-to-1 scale, the vertical axis would be very, very thin because it's a very long distance. We're going 100 kilometers, and that's only 50 or 100 meters at the deepest. Anyway, as we come back to this point of the high flow, and I'll get ready to stop this, now we have a flushing event where the rivers push the salt out. And they push the salt way out past Carquinez, and now the fresh water is pushing, but the stratification is becoming harder to push out, so it begins to push over the top. And now you have extreme vertical stratification in this period. And then once it relaxes, which I don't think this animation quite goes far enough, but when the high flows will start to relax, that will push that salt back underneath, and then it'll come back and stabilize again. So there's this very dynamic yearly process going on between the gravitational circulation and the net delta outflow. And again, don't have enough time to really do that justice. There's a whole day's worth of interesting things to look at there. So that's going to be the last slide for the moment. And what I was hoping to leave you with is we were talking about some basic physics of balancing net delta outflows, net flows, tidal mixing, and gravitational circulation. These are the three primary physical processes that cause things to move around in the system. And with that, give that back to you, Jay.
Thank you very much, John. We'll have some more animations a little bit later that look at management aspects rather than just the basic physics of the system. I'll talk a little bit about the boring part, which is our report. Our report is basically organized around 12 thoughts, if you will, to help organize thinking about how to use modeling for your board proceedings. We've divided the thoughts into three groups, sort of framing context kind of comments on modeling in general, some near-term recommendations on how to manage the use of models in your board deliberations. Hopefully they're useful for that. And then some thoughts on preparing for the future. Computer modeling takes a long time. It takes a long time to figure out these systems and then represent them and collect the data and figure out what it all means. So I think if you have a long-standing problem like the delta, some malice of forethought in this matter really helps a lot. Our report has some thoughts on specific models, so we won't have too much here on specific models. So just the general framing comments. This is one of my favorite cartoons for California water, and I think it applies to a lot of things. We have a basic problem of how do we manage and how do we explore very large, complex, and controversial problems. These are too large to rely on experimenting in the field only. Computer models, we can make mistakes a lot faster and a lot less expensively with a lot less damage to real people and fish. So I think that the general philosophy is of really modern engineering since the French in the 1850s is to use mathematical models to make your mistakes, and then you'll make fewer mistakes in the field. And we do this routinely in a lot of fields now. So first thought is models do not stand alone. We're often asked, what is the best model? Is calcium better than WEEP or calcium or Oasis or any other thing? What's the best model? And I think that's not a really good question. If you look at a good application of modeling that provides useful insights and useful numbers, you really see a combination of three things. There's a good model with good input data, artfully employed by a good modeler. And of those three components to a good modeling exercise, the modeler is actually the most important because the modeler will be selecting and making sure there's good quality control on the data. The data is never perfect, so you always are having to make some improvements and judgments on that. I think almost every model I've ever messed with, you have to convince that model to do something it really wasn't intended to do. And that takes, I think, a lot of skill for the modeler. And then, well, we're not done yet. And then in the end, you get results out of the model. And a good modeler will know that the model isn't exactly right. And that you're going to have to make some interpretation about how good those results are for the particular problem that the modeler was asked to explore.
How do you get a modeler to acknowledge that it's not exactly right? That
Good
seems
modelers
like the challenge of these.
That's
You do that automatically? Okay.
yeah, if someone isn't willing to tell you the weaknesses of their model, that says something about them.
So there is introspection with modelers.
For good ones.
Okay.
I want to give you an example of just the recent Hurricane Sandy. There are a couple of
The
maps
problem
here.
isn't the modeler, it's the people who get the information from the modeler that don't want to move.
Yeah, this is a problem. But just this gives a sense for, you can see the different storm tracks that were predicted for Hurricane Sandy. Lots of different models showing different storm tracks. You could throw up your hands and say, well, we just don't know. But in fact, there is some information and some insights that comes out of that scatter. And that was used by modelers to come up with that sort of probabilistic forecast.
Can I follow up on the comments?
Sure, go ahead.
So, the idea that the modeler is not showing introspection, I think, may speak to the type of dialogues that tend to happen, which is people turning to the modeler and saying, give us the answer, as opposed to having more of an ongoing dialogue in which some of those problems and concerns can be more forefronted. So.
Right. You have to ask them the right question.
Well, I mean, the problem is we're not privy to these challenges and conversations that go on between you. We see a model with the assumption that, you know, it's been identified to be functional or not before it's been field tested, as you say. And so you don't think I'm being critical of modelers. I'm just trying to understand what dialogue goes on that we aren't any part of.
Well, we talk a lot about models a lot. I mean, that's just what we do. That's what we do.
And if I
we have some suggestions along those lines in the report.
And just tacking on this, I think a model is a great place for starting a conversation and should never be taken at face value. And I think that's where Jay is going to go with his presentation here.
I like that.
Yeah, we'll get to some of these. Very good questions. Thank you. Let's go to the next.
Hey, while we're still on this general issue of modeling, with one who's done modeling myself, I found it compelling to bring up these three characteristics of importance: model, setup, calculations, as you say, the input data, the modeler. How about stating your assumptions? Isn't that on equal footing as those other issues? Is that related to input data?
A good modeler will be doing that. Different models are useful for different problems. So I have an example of different tools here. Hammers are different than screwdrivers. Use them for different things. And then different kinds of screws require different kinds of screwdrivers. It's my lame attempt at making it easy. Having a variety of models helps explore and test insights and estimates. Just like you often want a second opinion for an important piece of medical advice or budget forecasts or things like that. Same kind of things with any other technical aspects such as modeling. The next slide, please. This, I think, is one of my favorite ideas. Models really summarize our understanding of the system. These are very complex systems. There's a lot more going on here than we could ever possibly keep in our heads. Even the smartest, most experienced people in these systems don't know everything. And when you're looking at the future, which is really what you're interested in with management and policy, it's even harder for our intuition, even our very experienced intuition, to work out what's the system likely how it will behave with sea level rise and climate change and new introduced species and different kinds of operations and infrastructure. So we use these incredibly stupid machines called computers and these codes, computer codes, to explain every little thing that we can fit in about these complex systems into the computer. And because the computer is so stupid, we have to tell it every little thing. And then it works out essentially the what-ifs, for the most case, of what will happen if all those assumptions are correct. And then we can vary those assumptions. So this approach really uses models to summarize and integrate our understanding with far greater precision and technical transparency than we could have otherwise. And as was stated earlier, this provides also a forum where technical people